This is Chris Bolton. I'm the chairman and CEO of TheraCann International, and you're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh.
Hello, listener, and welcome back to the Professionally Cannabis Podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Weiser, and with me is your other host, Oscar Houseman. Today we have a really interesting episode and recorded all the way from London via Panama. Oscar, could you tell our listener more?
Yes, today we have a business about helping other businesses. It's an international consultancy that's worked from, working with governments in Peru to the Isle of Man through to business people, mostly at the beginning in Canada, but more lately all across the Americas and into Europe. It's a hugely wide-ranging episode, and Chris is a great speaker, so I think let's have less of our voices and more of his.
Absolutely. Let's take it away.
Where do they go, the smoke rings
It's a pleasure for me to introduce to the podcast today Chris Bolton, founder and CEO of TheraCann International, a full turnkey solution company based out of Panama, operating in 10 countries, having initiated over 200 projects and boasting over 3,962,000 cups of coffee. We can't wait to hear more. Welcome to Professionally Cannabis, Chris.
Hey, good morning, Jonathan, and happy May Day.
Happy May Day to you too, Chris. How's it celebrated out there in Panama?
Well, behind closed doors today, I'm afraid, Oscar. No one is venturing outside, and unless today is a Friday, they're female and they're operating within their allotted 2 hours based on the last number on their government ID.
Fascinating how different places around the world deal with COVID. But let's get back to cannabis and tell us, Chris, what led you to the plant?
Yeah, in a very roundabout way, I have to say I'm very happy to celebrate 30 years from how I got to where I started to where I am today in the cannabis space. And yesterday marked the third anniversary that I'm actually been in Panama to make this, of course, our head office for TheraCann International. 30 years ago, I was involved in prosecutions. I had come out at the bottom of another great recession, this one in Canada, based on the war in Kuwait, of course. And when I came out of my law school, I was put into a firm in a small town in central Alberta that managed federal prosecutions. And under that was everything that was non-provincial. So we did everything from income tax to, if you can even imagine, shipping act. But I spent all my days prosecuting drugs. And in particular, psilocybin and marijuana. It wasn't even discussed as cannabis back then. Under the Narcotic Control Act, it was marijuana. And we, of course, had many other opioids that were also part of the Central Alberta culture. But the two primary drugs of choice were always psilocybin and cannabis. Now, I was a very young guy. I was one of the youngest to graduate from my law school. And being thrown into the mix as a business lawyer, I was to be trained in business law, but beggars cannot be choosers. In order to article, I had to spend a year at a law firm. And so here I am thrown into court every day to deal with very real life situations where many of these people on second or third convictions were effectively going to jail. And after about 6 months, I realized very quickly that the type of people I was dealing with were dramatically opposed, both in personality, certainly with regards to their previous records, and the reason why they were taking such great risks, effectively, of giving up their liberties and going to jail. And I very quickly, at the end of 6 months, saw quite a differentiation between my psilocybin and my cannabis accused and all the others. And particularly if I was to look at their criminal record or history, rarely did they ever have a violence offense. Rarely, if ever, did they have a property offense, such as a B&E, to steal something to raise money to buy drugs. And when asked why would they take the risk, I start to see a pattern forming almost in every instance. Certainly in the case of the psilocybin, most of the times in the case of cannabis, that when I asked them why they did it while they were under oath as part of their sentencing, invariably they would say, "We're self-medicating." And I used to joke, and it was a bad joke, but I used to joke, with the court clerk in the steno, that I could predict that those would be the answers, thinking that they must have written something in the men's or female washroom. When you're asked by the prosecutor, these are very small courtrooms, very small courthouses, in the country, they would say, check out the response in the washroom. There must be something written in there that says when you're asked, say that you're self-medicating, maybe you'll get off easier. But that wasn't the case. It wasn't the case at all. They were speaking directly from the heart. So in my first year, I started chafing quite a bit with the others that were in my department because I honestly felt that we were wasting a lot of taxpayer dollars here. And these people who were from all walks of life, certainly, but certainly in central Alberta, many of them were farmers. They had families or their wives or their husbands, and they had kids, and they were productive members of the community, were effectively risking going to jail and even in what we'll call a medium security prison or a low end security prison in central Alberta. They were the ones that would be picked on, not in the sense of what you would see on TV, but they're the ones that do get the day passes to go back out and work their farm. But they would be, punished inside the prison by the other more, we'll say, bad types to bring stuff back into prison for them. They would be made the mules, effectively. And I won't go into how they were bringing stuff in, but invariably they'd be caught bringing in opioids into the prison. And once that happened, then throw away the key. At that point, their lives are effectively ruined. And so I started really bucking a trend in my department that this is probably not serving the best interests of the community. And under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there is a clause there called POG, Peace, Order, and Good Government. And even if someone is breaking the law, even if the law may be there to take away your rights, there are instances where perhaps it should be overlooked. If it is in the best interest of peace, order, and good government, then perhaps we should not be enforcing the law as it's been written. And that did not fly well in my department. The law firm I worked in made money by prosecuting everyone and everyone. So asking them to perhaps pass on files did not, as you can imagine, go over well, especially at the bottom of a recession like the one we're heading into now.
And when was this? Sorry, I've missed the timeline.
Sure. That would have been in 1989, 1990. And I was punished to go away and do what was, I think they thought to be a humiliating assignment to dive into the evils of psilocybin and cannabis and come back and present it to my peers effectively in the department to discuss, how wrong was I that this is truly evil. So I did have a good opportunity and a lot of free time given to me to go do that report. And I did it both in the United States and for Canada. And I was following the history of those two particular substances in parallel to the other opioids, particularly heroin at that time, and morphine, and looking at how each of these have become scheduled drugs and based on what evidence had been done. And what I found really interesting is on psilocybin and cannabis specifically, it was all anecdotal. Purely anecdotal. And I did see the switch in nomenclature. It was known as cannabis, but it became marijuana when it became time to make it a scheduled drug. Mm-hmm. It became marijuana because that was the term that was used by a certain segment of the population in the United States, which was meant to be a derogatory term, right? On the psilocybin side, they were equating it very much like a heroin, that this was absolutely 100% addictive, but there was no medical study to back it, whereas heroin had a lot of medical study to back it. And the other thing I found that was really interesting is there was so much research that was being conducted prior to, we'll call it prohibition, of these two substances that were really showing promise. Certainly on psilocybin being used as a psychoactive for patients that were effectively, if we would look at today's research, methods of rewiring the brain, which were really quite positive. They weren't negative. And in terms of cannabis, what was really interesting, aside from all of its many other uses, which everybody knew of back in the day, and certainly in Canada, growing up on the farm that I did, the other farm neighbors used to tell me it used to be illegal not to grow cannabis. Certainly through the war, World War I and II, they were mandated to grow it as part of the War Act to make hemp for all of its other possible uses. And how did that flip? It flipped so quickly, it flipped overnight. In Canada, not only was it anecdotal, but most of the evidence that had been brought to bear in Canada didn't even rely on an expert at all, not even from the medical community. This was purely political, 100% political. And when I had the opportunity to come back and present well-supported documentation as to how we got here, and that this was completely asinine, there was really no reason other than these were really political moves to protect perhaps some industries or some personal interests, that did not fly well. And within 6 months, I was out of that department. So, I had the opportunity to stay in law for 5 years until I left and started running businesses, hoping for the day that I might have a chance to come back and see these particular substances enter mainstream. And to my surprise, I got a call from a friend of mine that was a lawyer in Ottawa, which is the capital for Canada. to give me a call to say, you won't believe this, but within years after you're leaving law, Health Canada began cultivating marijuana for patients. And I thought it was a joke. You got to be kidding me. In 2001, Health Canada began to grow cannabis to give it directly to patients under a program that wasn't all that well conceived because the method of consumption for the patient had to be smoked. And many of these patients were palliative. And to be in an ICU or a palliative ward, having to leave the hospital and stand 15 meters outside the front door to smoke your medicine, again, I thought this is insane, that this can't be true. And sure enough, it was. The program had grown so fast and so quickly, however, it was beginning to bankrupt the department, if you can imagine. And by 2011, Health Canada was in trouble. You had to decide very definitively whether to proceed and continue to supply this product to patients as medicine or find a way to privatize it and get it into an industrial situation. And by 2013, that's exactly what happened. And I was thankful enough to be part of the first applications that went in June of 2013. And we watched, of course, effectively an industry ramp up from there.
We've been taken on your journey, and now we're in Panama, where the company is headquarters. Could you give our listeners a bit of an overview as to the type of clients you work with and the projects that are being run out of Panama and beyond?
Well, that's a great question. The type of client has evolved steadily since 2013. We're working primarily now with businessmen, businesswomen who understand how to operate a business that would generate somewhere between $40 and $80 million a year. And they're the ones that just want to focus on the day-to-day development of their business internationally. Our projects are designed for international import-export. And what we're wanting to work with those particular clients to do is we'll effectively be boots on the ground to do the cultivation, the extraction, the pack label, the disposal, the on-site lab, of course, and in some cases, the security. So they look to us to manage those projects. They're just interested in growing their business. And those are the primary clients we love to work with. So, for example, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Zimbabwe. Isle of Man is going to be the next step for us into Western Europe. We also have Peru. We have Argentina, Panama, of course, and then Canada and the United States, just to name a few. And in each of those jurisdictions is primarily businessmen and businesswomen who don't know properly how to cultivate a repeatable batch. And that's where we come in.
Interesting. So would you say that TheraCann primarily deals with the regulatory aspects of cultivation, the technical aspects, or somewhere in between, or something else entirely?
Well, we look at it as a global supply chain from top to bottom. And so this is much more than are we just making sure the regulatory compliance to the local legislation. We're working with projects that are interoperable by countries. So New Zealand is as capable in our project to export to Europe as to Canada. Canada is readily available to export to Europe as well as Australia, for example. And in order to do all of it, we had to satisfy, starting at the top level, the banks. Banks will not allow the opening of an account on a good day, certainly not allow large transactions in cash across country borders unless you can assure them that you're tracking every gram of it. And as we warned Health Canada almost 5 years ago, we had warned them, producers that were doing gray market. They were taking black market in the back door, putting a white label on it, sending it out the front door as if they made it on site. Never happened. So we had to build a very robust tracking technology and recording system, and that includes our BioTrace DNA tagant or silica food grade tagant that's applied to the product at the location. And it is then married and matched to the day-to-day operational data that could then be audited by a third-party auditor to show that what's showing for inventory actually matches up to day-to-day consumables, power, water usage, even the on-site labor costs that would be associated with producing that volume. All of it has to be recorded into an auditable ERP system. We call it ERPC, which is Enterprise Resource Planning and Compliance Software, that then had to be multilingual, of course, and multi-currency, that would allow these auditors to track all of it. We then had to add blockchain. We had to be able to show that from plant inception, whether it was seed, clone, or tissue, be able to follow that all the way through to the bitter end, which is consumption, destruction, or recall. By being able also to record all the information with regards to the vendors, to meet KYC, which is Know Your Customer, and AML, any money laundering. We were also able to show that the money that comes in and goes back out can be fully traced. And that is what enabled us to open up banking. So we do have a bank in Australia. We have one in Peru. We have one in Panama. We have one in Canada. And we're soon to open our next in Europe. That only happened because we can meet that level of compliance. All right. Next was the quality. Biggest issue that we've had, especially with international shipments, is you have to be able to replicate the batch. These orders are long-standing bulk order runs, and it's not a single order. It's not meant to be a one-time order or one-off order. It's meant to be a rolling order. In order to do rolling orders, what we're finding today in today's market is that the end buyer, usually a large bulk buyer, wants it to be same cannabinoid, terpene, and flavonoid profile if possible. And in order to replicate that, you have to be able to control all the root causes of variation in the plant itself. Not easy. Mother Nature wants that thing to take whatever she throws at it. And cannabis, unlike cucumber and unlike tomato, will very much vary its profile depending on what's currently available. So being able to control light, temperature, humidity, nutrient level, all of which, of course, is not easy on a good day. But we did it through Sprout AI. Sprout AI is using chambers that are 10 feet by 5 feet by 6 that are stackable, typically 3 levels high on rolling rack, 32 plants per habitat, and we are able to dial them right in. So every habitat's identical. We tend to want to use tissue clone as opposed to seed or a cutting so that we can have an identical clone from the previous batch to control it all. And for all of that, you have to be able to train your people to do it exactly the same way every single time. And again, no easy task. So all the root causes of variation, we've had to, 1, identify, 2, and control. And the tools that we'll use for that, for example, are Six Sigma, which is training I had while I managed the North American GE division, lean manufacturing, Kaizen, 5S, and effectively bring to the cannabis manufacturing sector all of the existing controls that we would find in aerospace and in pharmaceutical grade medicine.
And do you find that clients are typically coming to you right at the beginning of a project once it's been incepted, in theory, and they really want to execute it? Or do you find it's more on the other side of things where a company has tried to take on too much, bite off more than they can chew type of thing? There has been a lot of emphasis in the industry traditionally to be vertically integrated, and some organizations perhaps aren't capable of doing all of the bits across the value chain. Are folks coming to you after they've tried and failed to do certain things, or more typically at the beginning of their thought process?
Both. We have the ones that want to start from scratch, and that is part of our full turnkey. We also have what we call rescues, and the rescue client is the one that is at the point of failure. They've chewed up all of their capital or most of it. They're producing product that is low quality, low grade, and they just can't sell. And we've seen this again and again. Right now, certainly in today's climate, we're even looking for mergers and acquisitions and raising capital for that purpose, because many of these projects were almost there, but they didn't quite get it. And because of that, their assets, for our perspective, certainly have high value. But without solid intervention, they will fail. And we're seeing that right across the board. So a little bit of both. And we've also had a lot of governments come to us. So one of the things we have been doing, and this is going back from our inception, is we'll meet with the government from the perspective of let us help you. And we have drafted both Industrial Hemp Act and Regulation and Commercial Cannabis Act and Regulation that is designed to flex to local legal conditions, for example, statute law or common law, and allow them to pick it up and run with it, knowing it will be interoperable with many other countries. Now, often what will happen is we'll work with the federal government to get that in play, and then businessmen who have approached the government to figure out how to get started will often get referred by the government back to us to help them start up the program. So a little bit of both, but I'm happy to say we entertain both the rescue and the new projects always.
And are you able to give us some insight into the types of governments and countries you have worked with?
Yeah, absolutely. We had started with Canada on day one. At that time, it was a department of 5. Of course, now it's over a couple hundred. And at that time, we had highlighted on day one what we saw as gaps in the legislation. If you have followed Canada, of course, it did not go smoothly. We've gone through 4 full pieces of legislation in Canada, and it's still evolving. It never came together right the first time. And more importantly, the cycle time to process applications, what was supposed to be 90 days became years. 2.5 years in some cases to get a license to produce and sell, which of course weeded out many of the applicants. They just ran out of cash waiting. Now, we took much of the experience that we had from Canada and we've deployed it elsewhere. We have worked with the Department of Health in Australia, directly in New Zealand, of course. We helped tidy up the last 5 out of 9 segments of the Peruvian legislation. We did work with Congress in Colombia after we had warned them. We had it published that Colombia was likely going to lose its opportunity to export. And within 6 months of our publication, of course, the UN took all but 3% of their national production away to export. And we worked with them to help fill the gaps of traceability to enable Colombia to get back on its feet. And we wrote the the act and the regulation in Panama. And the act for commercial cannabis has gone through unanimously first reading. That was in January, and it would have been law but for COVID, as the Assembly has had to adjourn. In Africa, this time last year, we were presenting to the government of Zimbabwe. A year later, much of what we had presented has come to be, and we're happy to be participating in projects in Zimbabwe as a result. We've also worked on the outskirts of the South African legislation for both industrial hemp and medical cannabis. And I see on the outskirts and that we had provided them with a gap analysis as to what was missing that will preclude or if not curtail their ability to fully participate in Europe. So we're expecting to get back in front of them as we were planning to open an office in Cape Town back in January for the purpose of finishing that. And of course, there are, and I won't name them till they announce it, but there are 3 other governments in South Africa that are moving forward quickly for full legalization. And for that, we're providing both the regulatory act and regulation, as well as assistance directly to setting up a new department within those countries to manage what effectively will be a 90-day review process to get a license to produce, and then inspection required before they have a license to sell. So that will keep us gainfully busy. In Europe, we did a pilot project in Isle of Man. The pilot was for the purpose of doing gap analysis, of which we've done in many other countries, but also a feasibility study, like we've done for many federal governments, to show them what that would do for their bottom line, what might it mean for the economy, and more importantly, how consistent would that law be to the ones that are already in play in the countries? How hard, in other words, would it be to be able to adopt a law that's consistent within the country? Isle of Man was to be used as a test case for the UK as a whole to show whether this would fly, and then, of course, show its strengths over that of Guernsey and Jersey that had both raced into legislation without a lot of thought. So that's where we're playing right now.
I find the Isle of Man interesting. So I'd spoken to one doctor, member of the House of Parliament there, which is it called the House of Keys? Perhaps you're
That's correct, and 99 years old, and it's amazing.
And they're definitely trying to be the progressive force in the UK, or underneath the UK umbrella, let's say. But you say that's a project that is acting as a pilot for the rest of the UK? So do you think that
yes,
it'll be the canary in the mine?
Well, a little bit of both. Their challenge has been, of course, Guernsey and Jersey have already raced forward. The Isle of Man was originally to get in legislation by January of last year, and we finished the gap analysis up for them on the later half of last year. And because of COVID, obviously things have derailed in further review. But the idea, of course, being is that we would be able to put in projects on the island and show as an indoor cultivar of high-grade medical cannabis how it would work within not just the Department of Health, but how would the Department of Agriculture also apply its skill and repertoire to industrial hemp, which was to be grown for non-consumptive purposes. So it was going to be a very good, as you said, test case. As for canary in the coal mine, not exactly. I think that would be more suited to countries that would then also have a very vibrant domestic consumptive use. Isle of Man is 250,000 people, so not exactly the perfect test case for domestic use of medical cannabis. Not to say it couldn't, but it's a very small sample.
And you've had a chance to see loads of different regulatory outfits. Sounds like you've actually implemented some yourself. So I would say you probably have a sense of where you think regulators should be on a bunch of issues. Are you able to give us any comparison between different regulators? Who do you think gets it the most, and who do you think's got more work to do?
Well, they all have work to do, without a doubt. Last year, we presented in 9 countries around the world all to governments, showing them in many of those having existing legislations where their shortcomings were. I was quite surprised that even after 30 countries had adopted legislation, the new ones were still all thinking they were the first and that they would all recreate the wheel, every single one of them, without learning the mistakes of the others. The biggest primary issues that we've always had is they never once think that they need to design a system that is reliable, economic, practical, scalable, safe, and secure. Rarely ever. They'll knee-jerk it into effect because it's a political will. When we sit them down and say, in order for you to have a system that's robust, that will attract a number of investors, entrepreneurs into your sector, these are the risk areas that you must address on day one. For example, rarely, if ever, do they put on the department a timeline. It should not take more than 90 days to review an application that's been well filled out. If it's not rejected, don't sit there and hold their hand. Tell them to go back and complete it properly and resubmit it. Save your resources. At the end of 90 days, give them the right to go and produce. Once they produce, they can't sell it until you inspect it. So here's the list of what you need to do for inspection. That's world class. Here's a checklist. I've worked with governments that have been in their programs for 3 to 4 years that never came up with a checklist. Every auditor did it differently. There was no rhyme or reason. And in fact, you could get two completely different inspection outcomes depending on who the auditor was, which is insane. These are projects, capital projects of millions of dollars at risk that are completely arbitrarily inspected by inspectors, no fault of their own. The other thing that we looked at, of course, was whistleblower. I've been in many jurisdictions where the first to get licenses are friends and family within the department. No surprise. And being able to curtail that and be sure that it's a level playing field internationally is critical to protect the integrity of the program itself. Rarely, if ever, does the government sit down with the banks within its jurisdiction and say, this is coming. In Panama, I met with the superintendency of banks 2 years before we put the legislation before the assembly. A year after I was here and expressed that this is coming, it will come, it will happen. And 3 weeks before the first vote on it, they had not done anything. That superintendent, after the last meeting we had in December, resigned. And we now have a new superintendent who is now working very hard to get everything in play to allow the new applicants that will be under the new law in Panama to actually open an account here. We've got 67 banks in Panama. None of them knew it was coming. So there are these type of issues that, and there is a long list, these type of issues that we will sit down and address with governments and hold their hand and say, you're not the first, but we can help you leapfrog the other countries that have done it very poorly. And we can get you into the international arena that is compliant, that won't mess up your country banking system, that will allow you to quickly capitalize on these projects. Now, we've been in countries where, if managed properly, 10 projects, for example, will contribute to the GDP of the country. So why would you ignore that? Why would you do it so poorly that you won't be able to do international transactions that could honestly save your economy? And coming out of post-COVID now, any government that is not looking at cannabis, which is shown to be completely recession-proof as a product right now, is, to be honest, betting the farm on a dream. You know, and even speaking with large magnets for oil and gas, what we're selling high-quality product for on a per gram basis is more than a barrel of oil. So why wouldn't you want to ensure that this industry is thriving and not being hamstrung by poorly crafted legislation? And that is where we spend a lot of our time, helping them help themselves get through legislation quickly and in a way that's actually usable.
And continuing the theme of working with different countries and governments, are there countries and are there governments that, as an organization, you think you'd rather not work with for reasons outside of their current stance on cannabis and cannabis legislation?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't wish to be political, but every government that I've worked with, all I have to do is wait 4 years and they swap out with a new government. So I always treat them as if, you know, a year from now we'll be dealing with a different group. So I will never cross a government off the list, ever. It's just waiting them out until we get someone new. And the new people that come in are either there because of a passion for the product or a passion for the sector, or they've been given marching orders to fix it. And in which case, that's exactly what we'll do. I mean, we have been in governments, to be honest, have done this so poorly that you would ask, why would you even hop on a plane and go see them? them. But again, our goal here is to stabilize an international supply chain. We will always help anyone who is willing to take our offer. And once we've done that, then, it's all water on the bridge. I never look back, always look forward.
I'm interested to hear a bit more about Panama, just because as a domicile for your business, I assume there were a multitude of reasons that brought you there. I think Panama is most famously known in the public's mind for the Panama Papers, which suggests that tax deficiencies could be what brought you there. I was just wondering, what's the reason that you now live quite far away from Canada?
Well, that's a really, really good decision. And we do get asked that a lot by shareholders and debenture holders. When we started the process in 2015 as to full-scale expansion internationally of our business, we were advised by both KPMG and Deloitte at that time that putting our head office in Canada and maintaining it in the middle of the country was probably not economic. And they were absolutely right. Getting product manufactured like our Sprout AI units out to the ocean and shipping them around the world is extremely expensive. And in many cases, even getting it onto the highway into a port, onto a boat in Canada has become quite a problem, because all the oil is being shipped by rail right now because we can't get pipelines. We also looked at corporate income taxes. In Canada, the challenge that we had is at the end of the day, if I track every penny into the company out to my pocket, I'd be lucky to see, 15 to 18 cents left in it. It's all captured by taxes within the country as they went along. And the other challenge we had is Canada's banks, which are really only 5, struggle in holding accounts open for cannabis because they're all connected to U.S. intermediary banks, which they then have to provide accounting to at the end of the year. And rarely, if ever, will they take the time to do FinCEN compliance. So it's easier for them to toss a cannabis client out of their bank than to work with them and move forward. And 100 other reasons. Now, Panama for us, we were looking for a head office that would be middle hemisphere. We wanted it to be close to fly from anywhere in the world, that had a large international airport for that purpose. That was number one. Number two, we want to manufacture. We want to be able to get these technologies built locally and shipped as cost effectively as we can. And we're in Panama Pacifico, which is the high-tech park. It's 10 minutes from the Panama Canal on the Pacific Ocean side. Beautiful part of the world. But we're able to operate at least 35% cheaper here than we can anywhere else. Next was we had to find labor force that was multilingual, bilingual, trilingual, quadrilingual. And here in Panama City, which is a little over 780,000 expats, they are extremely well trained. It is the center for, as I say, 67 banks, plus we have all the consultancies. Plus, we have a number of high-tech companies here as well. And so having English and French and German and Portuguese, all as language that we can readily hire is just phenomenal. But getting back to the banks, I knew that if we were going to make this work, we had to get in front of them first. And you're absolutely right. Panama Papers factored in our decision because we knew those banks would be hypersensitive in opening accounts for cannabis and doing international large-scale cannabis transactions. And so thankfully, with my background as prosecutor, I at least be able to get in the door to meet with the senior compliance officer of the many main banks that are here and sit them down and say, I understand your concerns. I understand your compliance, not just for FinCEN, but also for FATF, which is the other compliance standard for most of the European-based banks. And here's how we do it. And here's how we can provide you the tools to do all your work for you. And here's how it can be done, not just between your branches, but between multiple banks internationally in full compliance. And that's taken a 3-year journey. But once we did it, we effectively got the Holy Grail. We were able to demonstrate not only could it be done, but these accounts over time could be held open. Not easy. And we have lost accounts here. Don't get me wrong. It was never simple, but it did start us on that path. So highly educated workforce, multilingual workforce, definitely lower taxes, lower costs of operation, definitely within Panama Pacifico, access to international banking and compliance. That's why we're here.
And I think that takes us quite nicely on to a topic around the team. Now, in terms of your headquarters, obviously you've set up there, you've scaled a team. What do you look for when you're bringing in folks into TheraCann? And does the over 3 million cups of coffee that you guys talk on your website lead into that?
Yeah, absolutely. We're very much looking for individuals that are truly entrepreneurial. There's nothing that we do here that we expect to be set in stone. We're in a highly dynamic environment and ever changing. We have to swing with not just regulatory framework changes, but even consumer product demand changes, technology changes, and the rest of it. And so being flexible and being able to creatively think outside the box, as we would say, is exactly what we're looking for. Now, sometimes that works. Sometimes it leads to division within the team. And so we have a program called Sandbox, which allows and encourages people to disagree with each other within the team. But if they cannot go for a beer at the end of the day, then that's an ending event. We have to be able to be working together and very, very flexible. We are international, which means effectively, if I'm up 24/7, I'm always getting messages from wherever in the world, and hence the coffee, right? We do drink a lot of coffee. But at the end of the day, for us, we've had 5-6 years tops to establish a stable global cannabis supply chain when none existed. The aeronautics industry had 200 years. Auto had 100 years. We had 6 years to put it all together, hence all the cups of coffee.
I noticed you said you'd take your team out for a beer. Assuming that some sort of regulated adult use market comes to Panama, would you change that for a cannabis product?
The bulk of the people that are in our company have a strong passion for medicine, and certainly with regards to cannabis, always. And it is a culture within our sector to promote the product. There's no question about it. It has been difficult bringing many members of our team from jurisdictions where it's legal to Panama, where it currently is illegal, in maintaining that be strictly enforced. But of course, at the end of the day, we're here to celebrate the product and products. We do see a day down the road where other psychedelics, which do have medical benefit, will be added to our repertoire. We'd be very happy to help these countries extend their legal framework to include, for example, like we discussed today, psilocybin as part of what's being produced and distributed and tracked and traced. So for sure, if you don't believe in the product, then I don't think the industry has a lot of interest. It is, as they say, highly dynamic. And for many that have, let's say, a low threshold, not knowing where some of these projects may be a year from now or 6 months from now, that may be unfathomable. But from our side, it's a long-term play. If you believe in the product and in the sector, then many of these shortcomings are just that. It's something to be tolerated while we further stabilize the sector as a whole.
What are the learnings that you could transfer from cannabis to psychedelics? I think this is something that most cannabis entrepreneurs I've spoken to are very interested in, despite being a different compound, different indications targeted. I think there's something about that new frontier that everyone still finds very exciting.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we do speak with a lot of researchers, so we've watched the R&D pick up from where it used to be back in the 60s, and then in some jurisdictions propel past that very quickly. But there's two primary lessons to be learned, one at a governmental level and then one from the industrial level, that we could really save a lot of time and pain having learned it so deeply on cannabis. On a regulatory level, never put the regulation in play until you know that you can get supply met, effectively creating demand through the promise of new legislation with no hope in hell of meeting the demand curve, because there simply is an absence of supply, just opens the back door to black market, and then we have all the evils that come with that. In order to stimulate the market, you must get ahead of it and find a way to ensure that those that are able to produce, in this case psilocybin, can produce it in the volume that you expect your country to want. And if you can get ahead of it, then for sure, not only will the industry know and be known to thrive, but it also means that we're going to curtail black market, keep the law enforcement agencies happy, but more importantly, the consumer is going to get a product that they expect. Every jurisdiction that we've wandered into where they, fast-tracked legislation, got it up and got it running very, very quickly for cannabis, only to have zero supply come out the other end. Improve being a good case in point. We warned them that if they didn't get ahead of it and allow more licenses to be readily available, that they were going to exhaust their local supply. They did very quickly. If you follow Peru, within 6 months of the program, they didn't have enough to meet the market. And like Uruguay, like Canada, like many U.S. states, like Australia, we have this large demand curve that's being filled outside of the legal market. So psilocybin can learn a lot from that. Number two, what's the technology that we're going to use to make psilocybin psilocybin. Are we growing for mushrooms? If we're growing for mushrooms, it's not going to be traditional. It's not going to be using a compost or a corn or a grain. Why? Because we've got a lot of variations with those, which are going to ultimately impact the yield of that crop, which we saw in cannabis. Medical grade LPs who we worked with, some of the largest in the world, they're varying 17% in what that product has batch to batch. Now, if that were wine, we'd all be celebrating. In the medical world, that would typically be a recall. That's not the same product. So for psilocybin, being able to ensure that it is produced identically each and every time without contaminants is going to be critical. And find a way to ensure that the technology is at an industrial scale. When we started with cannabis in 2013, the largest facility we saw at that time was 10,000 square feet, and that was deemed to be a whale. No one would even do a project now that is 10,000 square feet. It's deemed too small, unless you're a micro producer, of course. So for our side, getting ahead of the regulation, getting the technology well in play, having a fast track application process, make sure, darn sure, that we're able to get it in production quickly, get that product in the hands of the consumer when they get their prescription, for example, or when it becomes recreational is going to be critical.
Well, a fascinating area, and certainly one that we can't wait to hear more from you on next time you're on the pod. Chris, it's been a real pleasure having you on Professionally Cannabis. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Always a pleasure.
Well, listener, wasn't that insightful? We actually probably could have heard more about how Corona's being contained in Panama because, although we didn't record it, Chris told us some very interesting things. It's an alternative system where men are allowed one day, women the next, out the house. You've got a 2-hour allotment, and it's judged based on your ID number. And if you're outside of your 2-hour allotment, you can get given a $100,000 fine. So, listeners, as we come to the end today, I'd like you, once again, to like, subscribe, and share the podcast if it was useful. Feedback if you've got any suggestions. And until next time, take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Hello, please take me above. Take me with you.